Today we're going to talk about the French Revolution. One way to look at the French Revolution is this is the test of all the political philosophies that we've studied up until this point. So your political philosophies put to the test. Another way to look at the French Revolution, perhaps more cynically, or perhaps just more empirically, is that you have a revolution that's created by liberal ideas, Enlightenment ideas, and these liberals are fighting against conservatives who don't want to change. You have a lot of greed among wealthy, and then eventually kind of a lust for power among different groups of liberals. And you have a catastrophic amount of poverty, and when you put all these things together into one revolution, and then two more revolutions that follow it, caused by the initial revolution, what you truly have is a gigantic bloodbath. And then at the end of all this, at the end of a revolution that was fought initially to take power away from a monarch, you end up with an emperor in Napoleon who has much more power than the initial king has that this revolution was fought against. So, what are the causes of the French Revolution? The first is the three-estate system. And the three-estate system is a system to collect taxes. And the three-estate system is based on the medieval system of feudalism. In the feudal system, all of society was divided between clergy, then nobility, and then peasants. In the feudal system, the job of the clergy, which initially was the Catholic Church, Catholic clergy, and this is who we're talking about in France as well, had the job of getting people to heaven and teaching them about God. And for this reason, the clergy did not have to pay taxes, although they did own a significant amount of land in churches, in monasteries, and convents. The nobility's job was to fight, and because they fought to protect the people, the lowest nobles being knights, they also did not have to pay taxes. They protected people. So eventually it's this third class, and initially your class of peasants and your skilled laborers and eventually your merchants that pay all the taxes in kind, in food and in labor. So this three-estate system to collect taxes is based on the feudal system that divides all of society into these three groups. So in the three-estate system in France, everybody is divided into three groups. And like the feudal system, you have the clergy, which is the first estate. The second estate is the nobility. And then the third estate is everyone else. And this third estate represents about 97% of the French population. But because of the feudal system and the way taxes were collected from feudal times, this 97%, while only owning about 50% of the land and wealth, paid 100% of the general taxes. Okay, so this becomes important because like the American Revolution and like the English Civil War, the French Revolution is going to start because of disputes about taxes. An important development leading up to the French Revolution that causes this dispute about taxes to create a revolution is the rise in power of the bourgeoisie. Right? One of the coolest sounding words in the French Revolution. And your bourgeoisie are rich, urban, non-nobles, right? Obviously they're in the third estate, they're not noble. These guys are the merchant class, and they end up amassing a huge amount of wealth and power from trade. And it's enough power to check the nobility. And in the Marxist sense, which we'll come to talk about later on in the year, these revolutions are about the bourgeoisie taking power of countries from the nobility. So the bourgeoisie represent not just the power behind the third estate, but the Enlightenment thinking behind the third estate. So while these guys are small in number compared to the peasants in the countryside and the unskilled workers in the cities, they have great charismatic power. They've read all of the philosophers that we've talked about, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, etc. And they believe that their government should change to be more representative of the current times, particularly in the case of taxes, which they feel should be distributed more equally. So these bourgeoisie read the Enlightenment philosophers and also represent new money, as in money that is not inherited over time, but money that was made by these people during their lifetimes. The French Revolution is also greatly influenced by the American Revolution. As we know, it's the French that helped the Americans defeat the British Navy, and all of these French soldiers and sailors who come over and fight in the American Revolution, and that revolution is fought for these Enlightenment ideals we've been talking about, freedom, equality, democracy, private property, etc., etc. All these ideals are learned now by these French soldiers who then go back to France and are ruled over by essentially an absolute monarch with absolute power. Okay. But this absolute monarch, Louis XVI, doesn't actually have absolute power, mostly because he has a huge debt. He owes a lot of money. The Palace of Versailles takes a lot of money to maintain. He's helped fund the American Revolution, and his predecessors have helped fund many, many bloody religious conflicts during the 1600s. And so Louis has this huge debt, and the problem with that is in order to raise taxes, Louis has to call the Estates General, which is kind of like the French version of Parliament, and this is a group of representatives from each of the three estates who have to meet to okay any new taxes. So, our Estates General. This meets in 1789, and this is the most important date from the French Revolution that you should know. And you have representatives from each of the estates, right? Your first estate, remember, is the clergy. The second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is everyone else. And in this Estates General, and this meeting takes place at the Palace of Versailles, the third estate is primarily represented by the bourgeoisie and intellectuals in that group. Now, this group meets, as we said, to okay new taxes that the king might want. Now, they hadn't met in around 150 years, and so these are all new elections, new folks who had never been through this process before, and truly see this as an opportunity for them to get some more equality and some more power in the French government. Now, the first disputes in this Estates General that is eventually going to cause a revolution start because of voting issues. How are the estates going to vote? Now, how this works out is Louis has allowed the third estate to have 600 representatives, while the first estate only has 300 and the second estate only has 300. And Louis sees this as a way to show that he realizes that the third estate is truly the majority of the population. But nonetheless, as these guys get together, the first and second estate would like to vote using the structure of one estate, one vote. The first estate gets one vote, the second estate gets one vote, and the third estate gets one vote. And in this situation, your first and second estate would form an obvious alliance and keep their tax-exempt status, forcing the third estate to pay all the taxes. The third estate, on the other hand, would like to have one man, one vote, okay? A concept, popularized by Rousseau, by Locke, by the American Revolution. Even though Locke and the American revolutionaries don't allow, most men to vote because you have to own property, and in the Americans' case, you have to be white. Nonetheless, the third estate wants one man, one vote. And they know that there's a couple of members from the first estate who will come over and side with them, and a couple of members from the second estate who will come over and side with them. These are Enlightenment-minded people who would like to create some equality, even though it might be against their personal economic interest. And so if there's one man, one vote, the third estate will get a clear majority. And when we talk about majorities, remember Rousseau. So the king has a decision to make, and he decides that it's going to be one estate, one vote. And at this point, the third estate gets very angry, and they take their first revolutionary actions. The first revolutionary action by the third estate is, after getting a couple of members from the other two estates to join them, they have a meeting and they rename themselves. And it sounds like a simple gesture, but it is truly revolutionary. And the name they give themselves is the National Assembly. And they name themselves this because they believe they are the assembly that truly represents the nation of France. They believe they are France. The king tries to stop this from happening by locking them out of their meeting hall, in which case the National Assembly goes to another place in the palace where there is an indoor tennis court, and they meet and they pledge to continue meeting no matter what happens until they have a constitution written for France. They want France to be a constitutional monarchy. The king hears of this, and then Louis XVI decides to bring his army close to Paris. And at this point, the National Assembly feels threatened, they feel like they need some weapons, and they feel fairly angry. This leads the National Assembly to storm and take over the Bastille, a royal armory and prison in Paris. In the fall of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, is one of the greatest celebratory moments in the future of the French Revolution. And so, the Bastille falls. And I'll give you a pictorial description of this here. Here's the Bastille from the top view. It's a castle, a prison, an armory. It's surrounded by a moat with a drawbridge, and it's led by a commander named Delaunay. And you don't need to know his name, but that's his name, Delaunay. He doesn't have a lot of men guarding this prison and armory, a couple of dozen, but he does have the moat, the drawbridge, and he has some cannons. And what shows up at his front door are hundreds of angry members of the National Assembly with an angry Parisian mob. Remember, this is in the middle of Paris that this happens. These are buildings that I'm drawing here, in case you're wondering. So, Delaunay, not a stupid man, what he does is he lowers the drawbridge down and he invites all the members of the National Assembly in, kind of fiending that he's going to give up and let them in. He doesn't open the door to the actual prison. He lowers the drawbridge, and then all of these people come pouring in to this area here. And then, when all of these folks are inside of the moat, Delaunay then raises up the drawbridge and unleashes the cannon fire on all these members of the National Assembly and angry Parisians, slaughtering them. And at this point, it looks like Delaunay might have successfully protected the Bastille, but what he's forgotten is that he is in the middle of Paris, and there's lots of angry Parisians watching this happen. And so pretty much every Parisian who is Enlightenment-minded or who has a problem with the king and has a gun starts getting their guns and opening fire on the defenders of the Bastille. Most of them die. Delaunay surrenders. And then if you saw the picture from the previous slide, Delaunay has his head chopped off. It's put on top of a spear and carried by an angry mob around France in the name of the revolution, things like equality, fraternity, that's brotherhood, democracy. And here you have this first really bloody, violent act, which you could see as a harbinger of things to come, even though it's done in the name of brotherhood and equality and democracy. At this point, it is important to remember that Paris at that time has lots and lots of angry folks. They are very, very hungry. They're hungry because there's been some bad harvests. They are poor. And if you have a large group of angry people in one place, and you throw in a charismatic leader like some of these members of the bourgeoisie, what you can very easily have is mobs. And lots of the violent actions in this revolution are caused by angry mobs of hungry poor people led by the bourgeoisie. So here in this painting, Liberty Guiding the People, I see represented the greatest triumph of the revolution. The National Assembly takes down the Bastille, and when that happens, Louis XIV decides to let the National Assembly have some of its demands. He tells the National Assembly, you may write your constitution. At this point, Louis seems to have given up to the revolutionaries. He's still going to be king, but he is going to have established a constitutional monarchy, like what was created during the English Civil War, or the end of the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. Liberty Guiding the People. You see liberty here depicted as a woman, so even though most of the philosophers, Rousseau, Locke, Montesquieu, were misogynists, didn't believe that women were smart enough to participate in the government, they are still beautiful and idealistic, and thus liberty is leading with the French tricolor here. This is the revolutionary French flag, and the colors represent liberty, freedom, equality, and fraternity, brotherhood, not sisterhood. So, the National Assembly wins this great victory. They're able to write their Constitution, the beginning of which is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which you guys have read, and they create a new government. This is the first new government in the French Revolution, called the Legislative Assembly. Remember, it is a constitutional monarchy, shares power with the king. So, at this point, the French Revolution arguably could have ended, and it would have been a great victory for democracy, you might say, and for equality and for Enlightenment ideas, and France could have been a peaceful constitutional monarchy. But sadly, for the folks in France, the Legislative Assembly makes two drastic mistakes. The first mistake concerns Louis XVI. Louis, when he actually reads the Constitution and realizes how much power he's lost, he flees to Austria. He runs away. He actually dresses himself and his family up like peasants. They get in a horse cart. They flee to Austria, but they're caught, busted, and they're brought back. The problem is the Legislative Assembly covers this escape up. They are not transparent. They lie to the people about Louis fleeing. They believe that if the population in France knew that the king had essentially committed treason and fled from the new government to try to go to Austria, that there would be riots in the streets and lots of bloodshed. So they cover it up. The other thing they do, which is even more of a catastrophic mistake, arguably, is when they realized Louis was going to Austria, and that Austria may have wanted to declare war on France to stop this revolution from spreading. Austria, ruled by kings like the other European nations, and they're afraid of this revolution spreading. When the Legislative Assembly realizes Austria was looking to perhaps declare war on them, they declare war on Austria. And this is really bad, because remember, this whole thing starts because the government is broke, and they don't have a lot of money at this point either. And it's also a brand new government, so they're not particularly organized. And so here you have a government that has no money, essentially, and has a great lack of organization trying to fight an international war. It's just a really, really bad idea. And they immediately start to lose. And they don't just start to lose to Austria, but other European countries join in this fight with the Austrians to try to crush these revolutionary ideas. So what happens to the Legislative Assembly? Well, a majority of people, you might argue, in Paris, led by this group of radicals called the Paris Commune, attack the government and violently overthrow the Legislative Assembly. And here you have the second revolution in this French Revolution. And it is fueled particularly by the ideas of Rousseau. And remember, Rousseau believes if a majority of the people don't agree with the government immediately loses all of its viability. and it's just dissolved. So revolution is very easy, okay? So, the Paris Commune overthrows the Legislative Assembly, takes over the government. The Paris Commune, following Rousseau's ideas, believe in essentially one branch of government with absolute power that is elected democratically. So the Paris Commune writes a new constitution for a new government. This is now the second official new government in the French Revolution. This new government is called the National Convention. And this stage of the revolution is called the radical stage. The previous stage, starting with the National Assembly, was called the Republican stage. Republican in the beginning, more peaceful, more equality, more moderate, and the radical stage becomes very extreme. So this National Convention, interesting things about it, is the first government, I believe in history, that is elected by universal male suffrage. All men could vote. Most of the population, women, still not seen as able to participate politically, but for the first time, even poor men could vote. So this National Convention, one group, democratically elected, with absolute power, one of the first things they do is they put Louis XVI on trial and they chop off his head. This is a huge mistake. The National Convention believed that the people would be happy that their king was dead because he committed treason. What they seem to have neglected to have thought about is the majority of the French population are peasants. They're not educated. And to the majority of the French population, Louis XVI is like a father. They don't necessarily like what the king does. They're angry because they're hungry and they think that part of this is the king's fault. But they don't want to kill the father of the country. And so when they kill Louis, this starts the counter-revolution. The third revolution in the French Revolution. The counter-revolution is not successful, though. The other thing that the National Convention does that fuels this counter-revolution and continues to make people extremely angry is they outlaw the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, along with the king, are the most important aspects of life to the majority of the poor French people. So this creates a particularly bad situation for the National Convention. So now, the National Convention now has two extraordinarily bad problems on their hand. First, they have the counter-revolution, which they've started. So essentially, most of the country is revolting against their government. And second, and this is a problem they inherited, they have an international war. So they have a revolution inside France, an international war outside France, and these armies are actually conquering parts of France. It's absolutely the worst imaginable situation for a new government to be in. So what do? Well, remember, these guys have absolute power. So the first thing they do is they take the absolute power that the National Convention has and they give it to 12 people, the Committee of Public Safety. This Committee of Public Safety is led by Maximilien Robespierre, one of the coolest names in the French Revolution. The Committee of Public Safety takes two actions. To fight the counter-revolution, they create the Terror, known in America as the Reign of Terror. They actually name this policy the Terror. Its intent is to terrorize the French population. And as you've read in the administration of the Terror from your book, essentially it allows every French person to accuse any other French person of crimes against the government. And the crimes against the government can be any form of disagreeing with the government, whether in word, in deed, in print, whatever. The penalty for disagreeing with the government is death. And as a result of this terror, 50,000 probably, although there's no clear numbers, but up to 50,000 French people are killed. Although it's brutal, although it's horrific, and although Robespierre, the guy who's primarily in charge of this, at least as far as history is concerned, he had some other guys, and Robespierre although this is successful, the counter-revolution is crushed. Robespierre eventually becomes paranoid, turns on other members of the National Convention, has them killed, and in the end, Robespierre's own people go behind his back, realize that either they're going to die or Robespierre is going to die, and so they put Robespierre on trial for treason and kill him. And the Reign of Terror ends, but not before it crushes the counter-revolution. To fight the international war, the Committee of Public Safety create the levy en masse. Levy is a military draft. En masse means everyone. They drafted everybody in France into the army. If you were a man of fighting age, you were fighting. Women made clothes, uniforms, tents, bandages, cared for the wounded. Little kids went around the street picking up lint or picking up used bullets so they could be melted down and used again. Old men were sent from town to town to give inspirational speeches to join the revolution. Everybody had a job, and for the first time in history, there is a 1 million-person army led by the French. And this levy en masse helps push the enemies of France back in the international war. So while the war is still going on, the levy en masse starts to make it victorious for France. France actually starts conquering new territory. With Robespierre's execution, though, the National Convention realizes that it has taken perhaps some steps that were too drastic, killing 50,000 people, and voluntarily steps down. And this is important just in that the National Convention had the wherewithal and the democratic mindsets that although they acted in a totalitarian and barbaric way, they have enough of those Enlightenment ideas in their head to voluntarily step down and turn power over to a new government that's going to be called the Directory. Here's some propaganda put out by the National Convention. Here's the National Convention. Here's the king. National Convention. Here's the levy en masse. You can see the French army, the French tricolor here, other kings here, and I believe on what they're standing on is perhaps the other nobility in Europe. Here we have the execution of Louis. There's his head, shown to everybody to make sure he's dead. And you got to know that the National Convention thought that this might cause some problems because you can see how much of the army is present in case this actually starts. Here's Robespierre, pretty fine-looking dresser. Here's some propaganda for the levy en masse. Over here you see the beautiful women seeing the soldiers off to battle, very patriotic. And over here I believe this is the Dutch here invading France, and here you have the French soldiers killing the invaders from many countries here with poop. They're pooping on them here, and there's the soldiers dying. Apparently, the propaganda back in the day was much more vulgar. Here, you have the National Convention executing all of the prisoners in Paris to make room for political prisoners. So the prisons were already full, but to make room for the Reign of Terror, to hold people before they were executed, they had to actually murder all the people in the prisons. And this one here says, Citizen Guillotine has a knack for designing consensus maintenance tools. It's a joke. Consensus means agreeing. So the guillotine is a great tool for making everybody agree. Here's Robespierre's death. Here's him getting guillotined. Some people say that he was shot in the face while he was arrested. Notice he's shown here, with no weapons, so this might have been some propaganda to make Robespierre look good. Other people say that he tried to commit suicide before the guillotine. He put a pistol in his mouth and it blew out his cheeks instead of his head. But one way or another, on his way to the guillotine, Robespierre had a cloth wrapped around his head with a big bullet wound in his jaw. And in his long walk to the guillotine, the streets of Paris were lined with people with rotten fruit and vegetables to throw at Robespierre, as he'd become quite unpopular by the time of his execution. Where we'll leave this part of the French Revolution is the coup d'etat. And the coup d'etat means change of state. A coup, generally speaking, is a less violent revolution from inside the government. Coups are generally led by the military. And in 1789, Napoleon led a coup, organized in large part by his wife Josephine, against the new government of France, which was the Directory. The two things to remember about the Directory, besides the fact that they're overthrown by Napoleon, was one, they separated the powers, listening to Montesquieu, because the National Convention did not and became very brutal. And the second is they were very corrupt. Lots of people were stealing money from the French government, making the government hard to manage, making the people unhappy, and thus allowing Napoleon to come in and take over. So that's where we'll leave this off. In the next presentation, we'll talk about the life and times of Napoleon Bonaparte. Thank you.